Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world.
Hello, everyone. I am content editor Michael Woodson, and welcome to the Writer's Digest Presents podcast. In the publishing world, we spend a lot of time talking about genre. And a lot of authors know exactly the genre they want to write in. You know, I want to write romance, I want to write fantasy, I want to write sci-fi, I want to write horror. But what about those writers with story ideas that don't easily fit into a category? Should they shift the story to better fit a marketing mold, or should they just keep writing and have faith that their story will find the right home? I'm interested in these stories, the ones that go against the trend and are hard to describe. Today, I'm chatting with Hilary Leichter. Hilary is the best-selling author of two of my favorite books, Temporary and Terrace Story, and she's also a professor at Columbia University. Hilary and I talked all about breaking writing rules, writing against trends, and how an author might categorize their work differently than a publisher does. Here's my conversation with Hilary. Hilary, thank you so much for joining me and Writer's Digest today. I love your books. I love your writing. And one of my favorite aspects of recommending your books to people is that they are delightfully difficult to describe, you know? And I end up just being like, just read it. Trust me, just read it. Because when you look up Temporary, for example, your debut, it's categorized under a lot of different possible genres. And that got me thinking about the writer's job, which is to write, and the publisher's job, which is to sell. And for them to sell, they do have to try and find, I guess, the most sellable genre category. So as we begin, I did want to give you an opportunity. How would you describe your writing, and does it differ from what you've heard from other people?
Oh man, that's a great question.
Oh.
That's like my favorite question. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me. Um, yes, it always differs because in my head, when I sit down to write, I'm not thinking about genre
Mm,
at all, and maybe we can talk more about that. But I think of my works as realism,
totally.
and I think Temporary is a work of realism. I think Terrace Story is a work of realism as well. And I think that
Hmm.
if you're not writing from a place of what is emotionally real to you, then it the reader can feel it
Yeah.
acutely. And so if I went in to Temporary thinking I am going to create a picaresque romp with a dash of absurdism,
Mm-hmm.
then I think I would be focusing on the wrong thing. And
Completely.
instead, when I sat down to write that book, it was like, help. I hate the work that I'm doing in the world. I hate um,
Mm.
the way that my identity feels connected to how I make money and how I pay rent, and how can I put that into words? How can I put that into story? And
Mm.
that's really where I always start.
I love hearing you say it is a question I had, and we'll just jump right into it, that you don't consider genre while you're writing. Because I think that probably a lot of authors are similar. I certainly don't think about genre when I'm writing, but
Yeah.
there are genre writers, and there are writers who say, like, I want to write a romance, I want to write a fantasy. And there is I guess more space for finding help when you know you want to write a genre, and then but when you want to sit down and just write and you're not considering genre, it can feel a little bit paralyzing. Because I mean, at least for me, I endlessly have all of the writerly rules running around my head. It's like it can only be this long, it has to be sellable, all of
Mhm.
these things. So what is your advice for writers who are feeling like I'm not thinking about genre, and is that a bad thing?
I want to hear about the rules that you're thinking about because they sound awful. What is that list that's so is it sellable? Is it
Like,
um
and just, there are done opinions about how long your debut novel should be, what is a sellable number of pages, number of word count,
okay.
and that really, um, maybe it's just like the people pleaser in me being like, this is going to be too long, nobody's going to like or want to read it, and then I just get paralyzed by worrying about all of these things that make a book worth selling and then worth reading.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
understand that. I'm so glad I didn't know about any of those things. Um, I my massive ignorance has been such a huge
Love that.
asset in my life. You know, the dumber I am in certain situations, I feel like the more successful I am.
Yeah.
And so with I'm just gonna tell you exactly how I dealt with those questions. With temporary, I I did not know that I was doing anything that would not be considered sellable. I did not know that it was short. I didn't know
Mhm.
that um, books should generally have one cast of characters and not have to build a new set and a new entire location and set of people for every 20 pages. I didn't know that any of these things were things that people thought. I don't think that they're true. I think they're
Totally.
wrong, but I didn't know that. And so then when we went to sell the book, it was rejected pretty much by everyone. Um, and I thought, okay, I guess I'm going to law school.
Wow.
I really, I thought, okay, but I received a lot of feedback encouraging me to push it in the kinds of directions that you're
Mhm.
articulating so clearly. And I really feel, and I try and communicate this to my students and to myself over and over
Mhm.
again for each new project. I think that you have to sort of create a delusion.
Mm.
You're writing a book that you know what's best for it and that it deserves to be in the world. And
Wow.
there's a difference between being open to criticism and changing the thing that it is important to you to create. And so I just kind of decided that I wasn't going to do any of that. I did revise the book in a big way, but toward the ends that I was already working toward and not toward any of the sort of feedback that didn't resonate with me.
Mhm. Right.
And then it found its home. It found its home at an indie publisher, which
Yeah.
is
We
exactly
love
where,
indies.
yeah, Coffee House Press and the great Emily Books, which unfortunately is no longer publishing. But these are people and editors who understand things that are offbeat, things that are, not following those rules that are running through your head. And that was where it belonged, and they understood it and were best suited to kind of bring it to readers and
Mhm.
present it to readers and to talk about it in the way that you were describing in your first question. What genre is this? How do we present this to book clubs, to
Mhm.
libraries, to bookstores? Because I don't want to think about any of that when
Yeah,
I'm
and
writing
you
a
shouldn't.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah. For Terrace Story, the original draft that I handed to my agent was 30,000 words, which is
Mm.
basically a thick pamphlet. And I think, I don't know what numbers people say for
Mhm.
novels nowadays, but it's certainly not that, right?
Mhm.
I think a 30,000 word novel is
Delightful.
glorious, delicious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the final version of it ended up being closer to 41,000 words.
Mhm.
But yeah, it still lives in that really short, one sitting
Mhm.
space. And I think that's exactly where it belongs. And
Mhm.
thinking about what your book is telling you it wants to be without
Mhm.
sounding too woo woo about it. What
No,
is
completely.
the book that you made? Listen to that before you listen
Yeah.
to someone else's rules for someone else's book,
Yeah.
because there's no rule that is one size fits all.
Yeah, and I was just yesterday talking to Sadie Dean, who's the editor in chief of Script magazine, and
Mhm.
we were talking about script writing, and she made the point that like there are script rules and they are meant to be broken, and
Yeah.
the best scripts you
Yes.
read are the ones that break all of the rules.
Right.
And I do think uh I don't want to say genreless, but like books that are hard to categorize, what makes them really feel so refreshing is that as writers and people who studied writing, we study the craft of critique, and so in our head is like, oh, they critiqued this, okay, so I shouldn't do that, and that's a rule
Mhm.
now.
Mm.
um and it's just fun, like breaking the rules is a lot of fun.
I mean, who wants to like write a book and then someone review it and say, what a rule follower that writer
Which is
is?
like, I know that's hard. I am such a rule follower in life. Like I'm like,
I am too. I know
yeah,
you wouldn't, I mean, like from everything I'm saying right now, you wouldn't
but
think so.
creatively, like my characters can break the rules. Yeah, I'm not going to.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah,
what's the point of all this if they can't? And
totally.
I think I think that's right. I think breaking rules is fun. Breaking
Hmm.
rules is the thing that um, is the argument for why novels should still exist.
Exist. Yeah,
Because
totally.
why not just watch Netflix, or why
Hmm.
not just play, a 7-part video game with like a gorgeous narrative arc? There are other ways to receive narrative, and
Hmm.
so what are we even doing if we're not
Yeah.
constantly questioning the mechanism that we're delivering stories to a reader, and thinking about things that the novel contains that are just
Hmm.
hiding right underneath the surface.
Yes. Yeah, and it's I think it's something too where writers, I think we are concerned about finding readers generally. Like, of course,
Mm.
we want our stories to be read and beloved. And then our heads, at least for me, it's like either no one's reading it or everyone's reading it. And
Mhm.
for everyone to read it, it's like, how do I please everyone? And it reminds me of Roger Ebert. I think he was talking about when Brokeback Mountain came out and people were saying it's too specific. And he said, like, specificity is more universal. Like the more specific story
Mhm.
is, the more people can relate to it. And um I think stories that are more specific, like the readership is really, really uh loyal, and they're really invested in the story you're reading, or they're reading, which I think is also a really special thing about books that sort of like um to the line of like realism, magic realism, absurdism, literary fiction, things that are less tangible in terms of genre and more just like are specific in how broad they can possibly be, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I have something controversial to
Say
say,
it.
which
Yeah.
is that I don't think about my readers at all.
Totally.
And I mean that actually from a place of deep, deep respect. Like I I think that for any book, that any novel, because I write novels, that you
Hmm.
sit down to read, the only two people that exist on
Hmm.
the page are the author and the reader. The characters are not characters, they're words. There's no one in a book. There's just text and
Hmm.
paper. If we're talking about fiction, there's no one with real feelings. There's no one with real experiences. The only real, with a capital R, people are me and whoever is on the other side reading
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
And I don't want the reader to be thinking about me.
Totally.
I want them to be thinking about the book.
Mm.
And for the same reason, I don't think about the reader. I think
Wow.
about, and what that looks like in terms of writing is making every decision about what the experience of reading the book would be for a person,
Hmm.
but not thinking about the person who's reading it. And frankly, not thinking about if anyone will ever
Yeah,
read it.
complete. Yeah, totally.
It still blows my mind that anyone has read anything that I've written ever. To me, they're just like weird little Word documents on my desktop. That feeling doesn't go away, I don't think. And but if it's liberating for you or for anyone listening to not care about the reader, but
Oh,
to
I love
love
that.
them
Yeah.
kind of deeply. That's kind of how I feel. I don't
Yeah.
care who they are or how many of them there are or where they are, but I am deeply invested in their experience
That's
when they
really
pick up my book.
interesting you say about like you want them to think about the book and not Hilary Leichter.
Yeah.
And something that I do love about your books and I think maybe it's possibly like a kind of secret to like an invisible secret to like writing like uncategorizable books
Mm.
is setting a certain tone. And I love the tone of Temporary and I love the tone of Terrace Story. They like are playful, but they're so emotional.
Mm.
And I'm just wondering, how much do you think tone and sort of a writer's unique voice impacts the genre that it's going to be placed in, just aside from like the actual story itself?
Oh, I think I mean, I'm not sure because I've never been in charge of that decision, but
Right.
I think probably a lot. I think the gravity with which the material is approached
Hmm.
and or the uh what is the word I'm looking for? Not disrespect, but like kind of ah I'm thinking of like someone mischievous, like the mischief with which the material is approached. I mean, both
Mm,
of those can be literary fiction.
totally. Yes.
So, but I think you're right that there's different registers, and the combination of those registers informs genre. I'll
Yeah.
confess that voice and tone are things that are totally mysterious to me.
I
And
think they are for a lot of writers.
when someone asks about them, I like look for the exits and I'm like, oh, look over there. And I run because I don't, where does voice come from? I don't
Completely. Yes. Oh, I'm so good at saying that because I
know.
actually feel like voice, we're all like searching for it, but I think it just happens to us. Like we cannot, it's not tangible. I can't fake it. Like whatever the voice is, I don't actually think it's up to me.
I don't think so. I mean, I think in editing,
Yeah.
like so many things, if you are kind of open to being inspired and letting the work guide you, it's not up to you when you're writing. But then in editing, it becomes your responsibility to make the best version of the thing that ended up on the page. And so you
Hmm.
can edit toward the voice that you inhabited when you were
Hmm.
writing a book. But I absolutely think it comes from somewhere else, but it's also
Hmm.
your voice as a person
Yeah, absolutely.
that's inescapable.
Hmm.
But it's also syntax and grammar, and
Hmm.
it's time and the way that you use time on a sentence to
Mm.
sentence level, and it's perspective. Are is the book a direct address to another person that we can't see and that we don't know, and is it a direct address to us? Is it third person with this kind of omniscient god voice? All of those
Yeah.
things are a part of voice, and all of those things are everything that makes a book. And so how can we even begin to talk about
Yeah.
talk
Of
about it?
course. Yeah.
Voice is kind of um it's the container for everything, every
Hmm.
craft decision that you make on the
Wow.
page.
I love you mentioning time because I think time in particular is what is I love about temporary in particular, and the passage of time in that book is so good. And you wrote like one of the most beautiful paragraphs about like time that I've ever read. And this is not about our conversation, but I am just curious about like a book coming out at a time, like authors have no say in when their books come out. And Temporary came out the day of shutdowns in 2020. And so much of Temporary is kind of what a lot of people felt and experienced during COVID, was just like a loss of permanence. Um, did your relationship with your book evolve at all within that experience?
Yes. Oh
Yeah,
my goodness. Like for a debut book, what a lesson that was in
seriously.
our powerlessness in
Hmm.
all of this. I mean,
Hmm.
I thought I had written this kind of comic romp through which was a thinly veiled fabulous version of my own
Mm.
experiences with the gig economy, but I wouldn't have even used that phrase gig economy. And then suddenly, COVID happened and I had to be an expert on labor and work, and I
Mm.
wasn't. I wasn't. And there were some interviews where I was like, I'm just a fiction writer,
I'm
right?
just writing silly little words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like sitting there like reading David Graeber and Studs Terkel. I'm like, oh, I gotta know everything. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't. I mean, I'm a creative writer. I'm
Yeah.
not a union organizer or
Hmm.
an economist or any of those things. And there was something freeing about admitting that. Again, being ignorant, saving the
Oh,
day.
I love that. Yeah.
Um, but yes, I mean, I think this is something that I love the most about
Mm-hmm.
being a writer. And what it is, this is also a question about time for
Mm-hmm.
me. I think there is an idea that we are supposed to write about what we know and write about the
Mm-hmm.
world that we live in. But the world we live in is constantly changing. And the person you are when your book comes out is 5 people
Ago.
past the person you were when you wrote it. Exactly. Um,
Wow.
and so I think my books are always kind of this arrow shot into the future. I'm
Mm.
always thinking about things that I don't have or haven't experienced or am wondering about. And then by the time the book comes out, it's like it feels predictive
Mm.
in a weird way. And so I think, again, like, not to sound like a hippie, but if you are open to writing beyond what you know,
Mm.
then sometimes you can write about something that hasn't happened to you yet,
Completely.
but
Yeah.
will. And
Yeah.
that's happened with both of my books in different ways. Um, and how thrilling, you
Yeah.
know?
Completely.
I think I wouldn't have been able to. So, Tara's story, I wrote in, well, I wrote the short story version in 2017 and the rest of the book in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And then the book came out in 2023, and I had a baby this year,
Mm.
and I in 2024 for posterity.
Oh yeah, gosh, yeah. I didn't force you to do this 16 days after.
We are in 2024 now. And I don't think I would have been able to write this book if I had already been a mother.
Mm.
And I also don't think I would have been interested
That's
in
really
writing this book
interesting.
if
That's a
I'd
really
already.
good point. If you haven't read Terror Story, read it because that makes a lot more sense what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, it's about parenthood, it's about
Yeah.
family, it's about losing the people we love and losing parents, losing children, losing,
Mm-hmm.
love interest, every permutation of that. But and I just don't think I would have been able. But more importantly to me, at least, is that I don't think I would have been interested in
Completely.
like I'm interested in things that I'm dumb about,
Yeah.
that I don't know about.
Did you say dumb about?
Yeah.
Being dumb is really fun. I told my therapist the other day, like to be human is to be stupid.
Well, yes, I agree, but also, like, how much more fun is it to come at, like, if at the end of the day only a couple thousand or a couple hundred people are going to read our books, it's really the most important thing is our experience of writing them. And
Mm.
so isn't it more fun to sit down with something every day that you're curious about
Mm-hmm.
and where you're kind of a student of the thing that you're writing than to sit down as an expert? I don't know. The
Yeah.
former seems much more fun to me.
Yeah. And can we talk about writing process for a second? Because um, Terror Story is. I'm curious if your writing process was different for both books,
Mhm.
and I think because Terror Story is very special and comes around in a way that you just, as the reader, you just really don't anticipate, and it's a very emotional end. And in my head, I'm like, there that I wonder if that required more planning on your part, or if that did just sort of happen organically in the writing process.
It did.
Hmm.
Yeah, there was I don't outline
I love hearing that because I don't either, and it scares
yeah.
me to do it. Yeah,
I mean, if it works for some people,
yeah.
it works so well. For me, it just, the minute I've outlined it, it's like, well, that's done. And
On to the next.
the
Yeah.
impetus to write it dies.
Mm,
So I don't outline. The process for both books was weirdly similar.
mm,
And I keep sort of saying, oh, but the next book won't be like that. But maybe this is my thing. I don't know.
yeah.
But Terrace Story and Temporary were both short stories that I wrote. And um, the way that they end up in the final project of the book is different. Temporary sort of inflated like a balloon. And so
Mm,
the structure of the short story expands, and there's stuff in there that makes it into the novel. There's stuff that doesn't. There's so much more. And Terrace Story, the short story, was just the first section of the
Mm-hmm.
novel, almost verbatim. I mean, there's new stuff
Mm-hmm.
in there, but it's pretty much the same. So different in that sense, but wrote the short stories, published them, thought I was done with them because they were published, didn't think about them for a while, and then came back to them thinking, wow, the meaning of this has
Mm.
suddenly shifted in some unexpected way. For Temporary, it was that I was writing about being in my mid 20s and jumping from job to job to job and trying to fund my fiction writing habit
Mm-hmm.
with all these various sources of employment. And then I read it, 5 years later when I was 30 and thought, oh my God, this is still my life. And then I
Mm.
thought maybe this is my life forever. And that felt like a book. Um, for
Wow.
Terrace Story, I wrote it and then it was published a couple of years later. It was published in spring of 2020,
Mm-hmm.
right after Temporary came out, when suddenly the idea of having more space or a secret terrace
Wow.
that only opens up when a friend comes over meant something totally different. We were all
Yeah.
in lockdown. And I thought, oh, wow, I didn't know that that's what I was writing about. I didn't know that I was writing about grief.
Yeah.
And so I had a residency that summer, 2021, after there were vaccines and everything
Mm-hmm.
sort of started slowly starting up again. And I wrote it very, very quickly in order.
Oh, wow.
And yes, and I had no idea where it was going at all. So it was a surprise to me too. And that's something that really informs my work, the idea that if I'm surprised, the reader will be surprised as
Absolutely.
well, and preserving that wonder for myself so that I can deliver it to the person on the other side of the book.
Mm-hmm. So the idea that I love hearing that you wrote it in order. I don't think my brain works in a way that is able to write out of order.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I wouldn't know how
Yeah.
to do
I
that.
read interviews of people who are like, I had a wall full of sticky notes,
Yep.
and I would pull from chapter 12. I was like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many friends who do that and write beautiful books.
Yes.
It must work, but it just has never worked for me.
Yeah. No. And
Yeah.
also like nothing's worked for me yet. So what am I saying? But
Oh, no, no, don't say that. If you don't outline or do sticky notes, what do you do?
I really, honestly,
Secret.
I if when an idea just pops into my head, because that is how it's often from being inspired by a book that I'm just loving to read. I'm like, God, this was so good, and then a door opens in my brain. I'm like, oh, this, and then I just kind of attack it feverishly. And
That.
but again, like again, I haven't said this yet. I I'm I am personally not worried about plot when I'm writing.
Mhm.
But that's when I get sort of caught up in like rules bouncing around my head. It's like, but I don't know where this is going. So what's the point of
Course.
writing? And I just get in my own way. I think it's, every writer says that, but I tend to get in my own way a lot.
We all do.
Yeah.
I think if you're worrying about rules, if you're worrying about like craft rules, or if you're worrying about anything that isn't in the world of the thing you're writing, then I think it's worth sitting back and asking yourself what you're afraid of.
Mm.
I think like when those voices come in, like, oh, I can't write something like this, or I can't write something this short, or I can't write something this long, or this is too much like this other thing that already exists, or
Yeah.
anything like that that's not really about the thing you're writing. I think it's a signal that you are circling the red hot center of whatever you're writing, and it's terrifying.
Mm.
And so shifting to like, well, what am I so afraid of putting on the page? And then the answer to that question is what your book is about a lot of times,
Completely.
because when
Yeah.
you're not afraid, you don't care about any of
Completely.
those questions.
Yes. That's a good point. Yeah. Yes. Completely. And I do get caught in like just imposter syndrome of like, why do I think this is
Mhm.
worth it. Like, and I have the best writing group ever. It's me and my
Oh,
two
that's
very
wonderful.
best friends, and they
That's
are,
great.
yeah, and they are just really, and we're writing very different stuff. We write very different stuff, which is also really helpful, because then
Yeah.
I'll just be giving critique to a friend who's writing a script, and I'll be giving a critique to someone who's writing like a dystopian story about the education system, because she's a teacher
Oh,
and
wow.
she's seeing it happen.
Oh, I wanna read
And
that.
she has the best ideas. Her
That's
name's
great.
Marjorie. Yes. And I'm like, I hear what I'm saying to this person, and I'm telling them like, this is such a good idea. I love what you're writing. And I'm like, why, like, just, a mirror upon oneself and say that to myself, like, you know what, this is a good idea. I do like what you're writing, Michael.
You almost have to create a separate you to say
Hmm.
those things to you.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Have you watched Severance?
"Oh, yes, I have."
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to
Perhaps
split
be
yourself.
severed. Yeah. But be able to communicate.
Right, be able to
Yeah.
talk freely.
Yeah. um, Something that I love about your books too is that um, this idea that they are genreless in a way that I think is lovely is that, like, if a character opens a door this way, it could be, and if you chose to go that way, it could easily be horror. You could run in
Right.
that direction. You could run in like pure absurdism. You could go into magical realism. And I think that's also the joy of writing something where you're not worried about genre. And I guess, like, we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering, like, do you have advice for writers to just not remotely worry about that while they're in the writing process?
I mean, for one, it's not up to you.
Yeah,
Like, you
which is
could be
hard.
it's hard, but it's just not your choice. It's not your decision, and you could spend your whole writing process worrying about it and trying to write something that is horror and then have everyone tell you that it's not. And I mean, I know that genre labels are very, very important to people, for reasons that I don't want to dismiss, but to
Mm-hmm.
me they really are marketing categories,
Mm-hmm.
and anything you can do to push commerce away from your art for as long as possible, because it will assert itself at a
Mm-hmm.
certain point, and that's also not up to you. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as long as protecting this very fragile thing that you're making from money for
Mm-hmm.
as long as you can will make it more itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I know
Mm-hmm.
that's very hard advice to take. I think, in terms of practical advice, just it's the same advice that I would give for any question that you ask me here, is just to read widely, to
Yes.
read everything, um, to be omnivorous
Hmm.
in what you pick up off the shelf. And I think you'll start to see what everything has in common, and genre will sort of melt away at a
Yeah.
certain point. Um, I also think that that we live in a time when reality is something that is suddenly mutable
Hmm.
or up for debate. Um, we also live in a time where things that felt impossible are suddenly possible. And so, questioning what reality looks like and means and how much it can contain is part of the project of art.
Hmm.
And so,
Wow.
kind of like segregating things from reality and saying, well, this is a fable, or
Hmm.
this isn't realism, this is fantasy.
Hmm.
It kind of, I don't know, it makes it harder for us to be believed when we
Hmm.
try and
Hmm.
articulate the things that have happened in our lives. And so that's the kind of realism that I'm interested
Hmm.
in when I write. And I think it just makes the world a larger and more exciting and more terrifying and more unknowable
Hmm.
place to think about things that way.
Hmm. Yeah, the intersection of art and business is complicated, and
Yeah.
um
And important
of
too. And like
course.
the people who make those decisions about, what labels your book should
Mhm.
get on Amazon or whatever. They know what they're doing, and I certainly don't,
Yeah. And
unless.
hopefully they have your best interest in mind,
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah. And I think like ceding some of that control can also
completely.
be freeing, and
Absolutely.
understanding that we don't actually know best in every
Yeah. Yeah.
part
Oh,
of
except for
it.
us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Except for when we don't, ignorance is when it's joyful.
Exactly.
Um, well, but it reminds me of, I interviewed Brandon Taylor a couple years ago for the magazine, and he had advice that was similar to what you said before, which was like, this is supposed to be joyful. Like,
Yeah.
enjoy the writing you're doing. And he was saying, like, once you sell your art, like, it changes. Like, your relationship with it will change, and it can never go back to this moment where you're just writing it because you want to write it.
I
And
God, I totally agree with that.
yes, and that was really
Yeah.
thoughtful, and like, it impacted me greatly. And you're echoing that a lot here of like, don't, like, this is it. This moment is like the moment, and once you sell it, this, you can't ever get this moment back, so enjoy it. Don't worry
Yeah.
about all these things, let someone else worry about them.
It is the most magical time. No one is waiting for you. No one
Oh.
knows who you are. No one knows what you're doing. I mean, all those things are also true for me. Like, that's not, some of those things don't change. Like, no one is waiting for me. It's
Well,
fine.
I
Like,
am.
we don't need another book. It's good. You're good. Um, but, yeah, no one, you are in your own little corner making something out of
Mhm.
nothing, and to preserve that for as long as humanly possible,
Yeah.
because it does change.
Hilary, this has been so lovely.
Oh,
um
this is fun. Yeah,
yeah,
thank you, Michael.
I couldn't recommend your books more. If you want people to find you online, where can they find you?
HilaryLeichter.com. I
Perfect.
mean, I'm not there,
Yeah.
but you can find me.
Thanks so much, Hilary.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Visit us online at writersdigest.com and make sure to follow us on social media at Writer's Digest for daily updates on articles, online courses, live events, and more. See you next time.